Welcome back to Airgun Academy. Scope sights are more popular than ever. So for this episode, we'll go over some of the basics when considering the proper scope mount for your air rifle. Selecting scope mounts is more complex than you might think. The topic is so large, in fact, we'll need future episodes to continue the discussion. For this episode, we'll cover the basics. First, you need to understand what we mean by scope mounts and scope rings. The mount is secured to the rifle and provides a base for the attachment of the rings. It's the scope rings that actually hold the scope. Nowadays, most mounts and rings are made as a single unit. The term scope mount refers to the mount and the rings as well, but I'll also show you mount bases that are separate from the rings in future episodes of their own, because there can be a difference. But for the purposes of this episode, when I refer to scope mounts, I'm talking about the mount and the rings together. There are two main types of scope mounts: one-piece and two-piece. One-piece mounts are easier to install. Once you attach the base to the gun, both rings are also installed. With two-piece mounts, each mount and ring must be installed separately. However, this can be a big advantage. Some scopes have very short tubes that have limited space for scope rings. On these scopes, it would be impossible to use a one-piece scope mount because the rings wouldn't be in the right positions to fit the scope. Two-piece scope mounts are used when the scope has to be mounted over the magazine of a repeating gun. You should also use a two-piece scope mount for a more exact positioning of the scope on your gun. Once a one-piece mount is attached, the position of both rings is fixed. With two-piece mounts, the front ring moves independently of the rear ring. This allows for greater position flexibility. It's important to consider the height of the scope rings when selecting a scope mount for your gun. Low rings place the scope very close to the gun, but they do not provide much clearance for larger scopes. Remember, the larger the scope's objective bell, the higher it must be mounted to clear the gun. Choosing a scope mount that's made with the rings at the proper height can be difficult without the help of a dealer. Not only is the size of the scope a factor, but you also need to take in consideration the shape of the rifle. Some air rifles, like those from Air Force air guns, have an elevated scope mounting system. This provides extra clearance over the rest of the gun. However, some air guns have open rear sights exactly where the scope's objective bell will be when mounted. When you're ready to order your scope, let the dealer know the type of air gun you'll be mounting the scope to, and find out the ring height you'll need for proper clearance. The next consideration when selecting a scope mount is the size of the scope tube. The most popular sizes are 1 inch and 30 millimeter. These measurements refer to the diameter of the scope tube. As you can see, 30 millimeters is larger than 1 inch. The main thing to remember is that the rings you select have to match the scope tube you intend to use. Now, I want to mention a few considerations that are important, but must be addressed in future episodes of their own. The important thing for you to know is that these considerations exist and should be taken into account. The first of these considerations is the size of the dovetails on the rifle on which the mount will be installed. The most common sizes are 3/8 of an inch and 11 millimeter dovetail, and the Weaver dovetail, which is a proprietary size much larger than the 3/8 of an inch or 11 millimeter. The next consideration is the scope stop system employed by the particular air gun on which you intend to mount the scope. Various scope stop systems require different types of mounts that interface with each proprietary system. The last consideration that requires its own episode will focus on the special scope mounting issues of particular air guns. For example, the barrel may not be in line with the scope base on the gun. These require the use of specially prepared scope mounts and rings, or even adjustable scope mounts. In this episode, we talked about some of the considerations for selecting a scope mount for your air rifle. Let's recap what we've learned so far. We differentiated between one-piece and two-piece mounts, and when it's best to use either one. We talked about the importance of knowing the height of scope rings, and when it's best to consult a dealer. We went over why knowing the diameter of the scope tube is important when selecting a scope mount. We also briefly mentioned several topics that will be covered in detail in future episodes, including the types of rifle dovetails, scope stop systems used in particular air guns, and adjustable and specially machined scope mounts. We've only scratched the surface on scope mounts in this episode, but by the time you watch future episodes related to this topic, you'll be able to select the perfect scope mount for your airgun. Thanks for watching Airgun Academy. Stay tuned for another great lesson from Pyramid Air.